You're welcome to the spot, you know the truth is here. Bronx Tales on a beat, we see it clear. All the cases, all the shadows, we break it down. Pull up a seat, join the fam in this town. Every story matters, every voice you bring. We don't just talk the talk, we let the facts sing. Logan and Bronx, yeah, they lead the way. Shining light in the dark every single day. Yeah. Curiosity welcome, questions never wrong. Here you belong, it's a family strong. From cold cases to the ones unsolved. Together we uncover, together we evolve. No gossip, no rumors, we keep it real. Every detail matters, every clue you feel. We vibe, we learn, we investigate. Bronx Tales, true crime, let's elevate. We stay with us every night and day. We uncover the truth in our own way. Come here, let your mind explore. Bronx Tales, true crime, always more in store. Yeah, welcome home. Yeah, you're never alone.
Hello, welcome to Bronx Tales again. How are you guys? Happy Tuesday. I am so excited, you guys. We have Audrey from Glitch DNA Lab backstage, and I'm just so excited for her to be here. I know you guys are too. I saved all my questions, so we have more questions to ask her. I'm going to go ahead and bring her up really quick, and then we'll just get started. Make sure if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, but go ahead and save it for closer to the end so we can get through our other planned questions first. So thank you guys so much. Everything is alleged in our opinion only, just so everybody knows before we get started. All right, guys, let's bring her to the stage. Hello, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. Hello, chat.
Yes, it's so good to see you again. I feel like when we met last time, we kind of hit it off pretty good. So I was like, I'm so excited to have her on here.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here today.
So, quick question for you before we get started into all of our goody questions. How did you come up with the name Glitch DNA? Because it's pretty catchy.
Wow, thank you. So I started out as Audrey C's DNA podcast. And then I went into Trace DNA Lab, but then I was reading that these independent DNA experts were trying to move away from using the word trace DNA, just like they were trying to move away from the word touch DNA. And then I thought, what is it that I do? I think that I find glitches in the system. I'll find the DNA glitch because I find the anomalies at work where I'm trained to look at where the vulnerabilities are so that I can formally appeal the system using policy language. And so I thought these are the little glitches, the weak points. And so that is where Glitch DNA came from.
So cool. It's such a catchy name. Oh, hey, you guys. Oh, thanks, True Crime Cafe with Dago. We appreciate you so much.
Hi, Mikey.
He sent us $5 and said, please hit the like button for these ladies. Y'all show some love. We appreciate you, Dago, so much.
Yes, Dago.
So, is there anything about this case actually, before I get started, I was going to make a thumbnail earlier today and I went to click on your channel. Now, I always had the bell on your channel, so I always got your updates as soon as you would post them, right? So when I went today to grab a picture of you for the thumbnail, it said I wasn't subscribed. So I want to make sure that everybody in chat, if you have favorites that you watch, please go and check that you are still subscribed because YouTube is being funky lately. And I know for a fact that I was subscribed to Glitch DNA. So you guys just make sure you are subscribed and head on over to Glitch DNA Lab's channel and make sure and subscribe when you get a chance. So before I get started, I just want to make sure and say that because it happened to me earlier. And I was like, what is going on? All right. So now, a while ago, we heard on one of Lana's episodes about UC Davis and an experiment that they did with the Idaho 4 case in mind. And they did basically an experiment using the snap of the knife sheath and testing primary transfers as, in between primary transfers and secondary transfers, and if it would be possible and what number of, I think it's like NGs of DNA. I'm not a DNA person, so correct me if I'm wrong. And they just wanted to see, what would happen in their experiment versus what happened in this case. Are you familiar with the experiment that they did at UC Davis?
I am. I actually watched their presentation at ISHE, which is an International Forensic Science Convention, which I believe they have once a year, where lots of scientists, I know that there's ethicists that go, a lot of things that have to do with forensic science. So I was able to watch that, and I did look over the study before I got on here. So I am very familiar with that study, and I think that the last time I was on LinkedIn and I was checking up on what the independent DNA experts are saying on there, some of them have a lot of criticism for that particular study because there are a lot of elements that can go into the how and the when of the DNA. So you're not just looking at the amount of DNA, you're also looking at a live environment, you're looking at the physics of the object or a surface. How does that behave? You are also trying to figure out the TPPR, which is transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery. Transfer, as we know, that's the how and the when. What was the mechanism of transfer? Persistence is how long does that hang around on this particular surface that was found on? Persistence, how likely is it to be found? Is this a surface that DNA is likely to be found on? Is this common? And recovery are the recovery methods from the forensic team. So I think that even though in that study they do talk about wild pathways, which I believe is the live environment. So even if they are talking about and they are trying to mock in a laboratory setting what it would be like in a live setting, that you're still kind of under laboratory conditions. And it's very difficult to predict that kind of thing, whether it's primary or secondary, with all of these other elements that go into it, more than just the amount, because you're still using units of measure that have already been determined. The human body and biology isn't that perfect like these units of measure. Our bodies, they shed DNA at different rates. They call it shedder status, whether you shed a lot, you're a mild shedder, or you're a low shedder. And I don't think that we are consistent across the board. Like every time we touch or rub something, or if somebody else transfers our DNA or a DNA is transferred on a door or a surface, I don't think that we deposit the same amount of DNA each time because, again, you're dealing with the live environment. Do you have dry skin? Are we having hormonal changes in our body? So I think that there is a little bit more to this study than there is a lot more that goes into the how and the when of the DNA to determine if it's primary or secondary transfer. And a lot of the independent experts on LinkedIn, they do say that is something they may never know because you would either have to be clairvoyant or you would have to be there to know. And they're never there at the crime scene when it's happening. So I tend to agree with the independent DNA experts on LinkedIn that this particular study misses a lot of the nuance that goes into the how and the when of the DNA.
That makes a lot of sense too, especially since we know now that it wasn't the snap, right? It was the strap that it was swabbed from. And how likely is the DNA going to stay on a snap versus a strap anyways, right? It's less likely for that type of surface to hold on to the DNA versus the strap would hold on better because it's a porous surface, right?
Right.
Okay. So in essence, really, now that we know the difference, that it was the strap rather than the snap, that kind of study is pretty much a moot point at this moment because...
And I think that is the criticism that these independent DNA experts were having about that, because I don't know if they took into consideration the physics of the object. The physics of this particular object is a leather strap that flaps, it moves. So it's going to come in contact with a live environment more so than something that is stationary. Plus, when the knife is actually in the sheath, you have the guard, and the guard sticks out more than anything on the actual knife. That's a lint trap. Users of the K-bar have called that the K-bar bend because of the construction of the knife. Sometimes it can bend because that is a major point where there is a lot of pressure on that area. And also because it does stick out, it does snag a lot of the environment. And so does that flappy strap. So you have a lint zone because it's grabbing the environment anytime it moves, because one's in motion and the other one sticks out. So when you have a double lint zone, you're more likely, it's not surprising DNA would be on there. And in the biology notes, item 1.1 is described as a very light gray trace. To me, in my opinion only, that sounds like dust, debris that happened to have human DNA in it on a surface that is a lint trap.
That makes a lot of sense too. And as far as the amount of DNA, excuse me, that they found of Brian Koberger's, would you consider that to be a extremely low amount considering?
From what I understand, I believe that is a borderline. What I mean by borderline is borderline interpretable. And what goes into that is what they call a DNA slot machine, where different DNA software, whether you're using STRmix, TrueAllele, or another one, they set their thresholds at different levels. And they also have, every lab has their different policies and their different standards. So you could have 4 or 5 different analysts looking at the same sample, and they could all come up with a different answer. So you really don't know what biological, especially when it's borderline like that, you really are putting it into a slot machine and seeing how it goes with the different parameters that are set by these labs. So when it says, and also something else to keep in mind, because I always say be very cautious with DNA, there is a lot of nuance to it, especially the trace DNA, is that yes, you can have an amount which is borderline or an acceptable amount, but that doesn't mean it's actually a robust sample. It could be a degraded sample because it could be, depending on the physics of the surface, the persistence, the prevalence of the surface it's located on, that could affect the quality of that sample. So when you're talking about how much DNA you have, sometimes that might be secondary to, was the sample actually readable? Is it a quality sample? Is it robust enough to make these calls? And sometimes these calls are interpretation heavy, especially for borderline DNA, because these experts are relying on software for one, and two, they're making judgment calls on whether there is a true allele at the loci or it's an artifact, like another piece of dust. And especially when the software settings, which can be normal, but in this particular case, item 1.1, in every sample on the sheath, they failed standards for the first run. And then they also, the entire plate failed. They had ILS failure, which has to do with measuring the peaks with the software. They also had to do a requant, and they had to re-inject multiple times. So they were troubleshooting this sample. They had issues reading it. And there's multiple reasons why a lab may have trouble reading it. But again, this is what you should be cautious about, because even if they say, oh, it was a lot of DNA, or the DNA is at this level where we believe that it is actually primary transfer, but what are you actually reading? How did you actually read that? And that's a lot of the things that I do, is I ask about the rules, because the rules are very important to what I do every day. And I think that that's something we have the right to do. We are allowed to ask, what are the rules? How did you get that sample? What measurements did you use? Especially when you have one that's a borderline sample. And from my understanding, other countries in Europe and Australia, especially Australia, they would not use this type of DNA even in a regular case, let alone a capital case.
Yeah. And with all that being said, I actually have 2 questions with that. You mentioned, well, the first one I'll say is, now you take everything you just said and lump it together with the fact that we don't even know that it got there at crime time, right? As you
Exactly.
said before. I mean, that lint particle or whatever it was, the little bit of DNA that was there doesn't mean that it got there at the time of the crime. It could have gotten there any time before the time of the crime, before they swabbed the sample. And so you lump that together with everything you just said, and it makes it even more questionable.
I would like to add something to that, because, again, I'm talking about processes here, and one of the prosecution's arguments was about the make and model and year of the vehicle. And I believe it was in the response to the motion in limine, the state's response, where we saw the actual document from the FBI where they were asked to make charts and classifications of vehicles, which is the make, model, and year. The state never asked the FBI or the analyst to identify a vehicle. And when you're only asking limited questions, you're going to get limited answers. So they never asked for an identification of one specific vehicle. And in that chart that I think it was Imel, he said he was unable to identify the vehicle at 1112 because of a blooming headlight. And then you also have on top of that, the prosecutor at the plea hearing say, we can't place the defendant in the house or in connection with any of the victims, and we can only place the cell phone in the area. But then the question becomes, how big is that area? What is the square footage of where that area covers with those cell phone towers? Because the defendant could have been anywhere in that area. So when you have these flawed, I think that, in my opinion, that's a flawed argument when they're not really asking the analyst to identify a vehicle and they can only place a phone in one area, which is not the house by the admission of the prosecutor. And then you add in all the nuances with trace and transfer DNA, the how and when, the activity level of the DNA, and you add in the quality control issues. I think it really does paint a pattern that this is really secondary transfer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. So let me see here. We've got that. Okay. So with your knowledge, is it common to trust one lab for processing, or are swabs ever sent to like a second lab and a third lab for a second or third opinion ever?
From my understanding, there should be replicate testing, especially in a capital case. And the defense should have access to that. They should be able to run their own testing, especially if this DNA is going to be the backbone of the state's case. And in addition to that, you need replicate testing to make sure you have a consistent result, because sometimes you can test it and you'll get varying results, especially when you have like a borderline interpretable sample. Now, it could be right. However, the most glaring thing is that the DNA data in the ISP lab reports is still blacked out. It's literally redacted. So basically the public has taken the word for the state that this is actually a match. But I can't see we can't see the STR. Was it a full 20 by 20 STR? Was it a partial profile? Where were the alleles? Were those alleles questionable? Were they ghosting? And especially when you have a related population, because they were using IgG, all of their alleles are going to be very similar. So if you have any quality control issues, like we did with the whole plate, item 1.1, if there's an allele or two that is ghosting, or it's an artifact and there's a judgment call that might not be an accurate representation of what is actually on the sheath, you could potentially be on the wrong branch, or you could potentially have the wrong related family member from that tree, because the DNA from a related population is closer together than if you would use a likelihood ratio, like the one that law enforcement typically uses, whereas it's the source is likely the defendant other than a random person from the population, but they didn't find him from a random population. So they're using the wrong scientific tool. They should have been using an LR with the hypothesis from a related population. But that also, it can indicate contamination or false positives when you have a group of people where their DNA is more similar than a stranger population.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned the tree, and we heard that Othram was on the wrong branch of a tree. Now, had they continue working on it, would it have led to Brian Koberger, or would that not have led to Brian Koberger? And were they on the wrong tree or on the wrong branch, by your opinion?
This is where I have extreme caution because of the things I was saying before about you have a related group of people. It's more likely that their DNA, even though it's not the same, and it may not be that close, but it is certainly a lot closer than a random stranger population. So there is a likelihood that Brian Koberger could have been on the wrong branch depending on what happened in the ISP lab, because what happened in the ISP lab, they're a separate lab. So whatever issues they ran into, another lab is going to inherit that's those same issues. So whatever story is in that vial before the second lab receives it, that's the story, but that might not actually be an accurate representation of what was actually found in the sheath. It's hard to tell when the data is completely blacked out in the ISP report, and it's hard to tell if he was actually on the right or the wrong branch, because I don't even know if what information the defense got, whether they got the SOPs, whether they got their validation studies, because a lot of times with these private labs, they may not discover all those. They may not hand those over. So you don't know what their process is. And so that is a huge question. And I think that people, they might say that, okay, well, IgG is straightforward. You make a tree and it led here. But again, there are a lot of nuances that go into that too.
That makes sense. And with even just the questions that you've answered so far, doesn't it make both you and everybody in chat so upset when you heard the Judge Hippler say DNA is DNA every day of the week and twice on Sunday? Is that not the most frustrating thing ever?
That is. I think that is prejudicial. I think there should have been restraint with that comment. And that comment shows that Hippler does not understand DNA very well.
Yeah, he definitely didn't. And that's what's frustrating, especially when he had so much, obviously he's the judge. He's got so much say over this case and what happens even before trial, that when you have somebody with what sounds like zero knowledge on the one piece of evidence they think they have, it's really frustrating to hear a comment like that.
Absolutely.
So is there anything that the labs didn't do with the DNA swabs that you think maybe could have or should have been done?
Yes. So we have two different forensic timelines. It is in the forensic lab, their team, in their notes, that they documented as found because detectives have moved everything and they had moved beds before they arrived. And then it's also in their notes that they tried to put everything back the way that the pictures were as best they could. But when you're doing that, you're creating a risk for additional transfer events. So when you have that amount of transfer events, we don't even know what they moved, how they moved it. And that also causes a risk for the trace DNA they may have found on the sheath, where they deprioritized the other blood on the sheath. They had created multiple additional transfer events that were unnecessary. So I do think that caution for item 1.1 should come down for that as well. In addition, it also says in the ISP forensic team's lab notes that the detectives, they diluted the blood samples as they were recovering. They used too much water when they're recovering. So we don't know what kind of training these detectives have. And it was difficult for the DNA analysts to read these blood DNA profiles because of the collection methods that the detectives used. In addition, we had other detectives renumber some of these DNA samples. And then we have a DNA expert who had to correct her testimony on the official record because the particular sample that she was attributing to Xana was never actually tested. So the source for that DNA sample was never tested. And I know item 31.2 was never tested, and item 31.1 was Ethan as a major, and there was a minor that was never pursued. So I think that this is another one of those things, and I'm going to mention this report probably every time I speak. It's NIST DNA, forensic DNA interpretation, human factors through a systems approach. The scientific community wants to add the human factor element into the DNA interpretation. They're moving away from what does this individual DNA expert have to say, and what is the pipeline? What is from coroner to scene to court? How does that affect the actual biological sample? How does that affect the chain of custody? Are they following the rules? Are they following the policy? Because all of these little nuances, especially with trace DNA, they matter. And so when you don't have a pipeline, especially with this, this particular scene, the coroner was held away. She wasn't able to get on scene and do a forensic examination of the victims. And it doesn't matter how deceased they are, how many hours, she still needs to get there because it's extremely important that there is scientific documentation for the biology and for the medical professionals that are in law enforcement to have a record. The record in this case is very thin, especially with the moving of the mattresses. These are the surfaces that the state claims that the victims died on. And so those surfaces are some of the most important ones. It is like a fabric autopsy. And the way that they treated these mattresses is like furniture. We even saw them in the back of pickup trucks. And you can get a lot of information from the surface a victim died on because of the voids, the different blood patterns. There's so many things that go into that as well that I don't think they completely processed this scene. They missed blood samples. And so how can you have an accurate blood DNA record? And how do you have an actual record of the surface your victims died on? So for me, the record of this case is very thin, and it needs to be, it shouldn't be thin because you have DNA analysts, you have forensic profilers, you have a lot of other professionals that are downstream that have to rely on that record so they can actually give their professional opinion. So in my opinion, I think the way they handled this scene, there was ambiguity with who had authority here and what their roles were. And I think because of this confusion, the scene was not completely processed. And I don't think that that is acceptable. It's my opinion. That's not acceptable in a capital case or a death eligible case, especially when you want to aggregate trace DNA and you're not really sure what the blood DNA record is saying or what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's frustrating to me that we know they went back and asked Dylan for her bedside table, a nightstand, and her green and pink jacket that Ann Taylor was requesting that back as evidence. So we know that evidence was not processed correctly. It was given back to a survivor, and then it was asked back. They asked her for it back. And I was just wondering what would have happened if these mattresses that they handled, like you just said, like furniture, and then they were housed right next to Brian Koberger's car. What if they then had to go use those pieces of evidence and now you've just housed it next to Brian Koberger's car? Like, I could totally see them doing that. That's how much they messed up in this case, like you just stated. It's just ridiculous.
You bring up a great point because there's a lack of training there. There's a lack of knowing how to store, especially potential biological samples or anything that is potentially biological in nature. So it's apparent that they don't have training for that, or a very ineffective amount of training. And so there again, there could be an unnecessary transfer event that can change the direction of a death eligible case. And that's the recovery part of the TPPR. That's a scientific tool, the transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery. Even though the perception is police officers do the right thing, they know how to collect DNA. No, not in every case. And I think in this case, we are seeing some of the cracks in that. And we're seeing the lack of training, policy, rules, and regulations when it comes to actually housing and storing trace DNA. And so, I'm so sorry, I lost it. I don't remember.
Yeah, that's okay. It's just the fact that, they obviously don't have the training. I mean, we have a sheath that had actual blood on it, and instead they didn't test that, right?
Yeah.
They had it, they didn't test it, but they go ahead and test some piece of debris pretty much that's on the sheath. And it to me, it just shows, lack of pretty much, we can see it in the crime scene. They have lack of knowledge or training of what to do in this instance of a quadruple homicide or any homicide, really.
Yeah, I do think that medical professionals were not treated as adults in this case. I do know that the coroner system for Idaho, there were some new laws passed in March of 2025. So the coroner system prior to 2025, there's some questions about who has what role. And in that instance, where you're not even sure what role belongs to who, I'm unsure how that's actually acceptable in a death eligible capital case.
Yeah. And this isn't a DNA question or statement, but it's just strange to me that we had a coroner on scene, not really when they were supposed to be on scene. It seems like a little bit later. And we had people in and out of the house before her. And when she's in there, number one, she's not a medical examiner or a medical professional by any means. And she doesn't have anybody to answer to. So she doesn't really have anybody who's, checking her work or anything like that. And I find that interesting. We had a question in chat. Somebody just wanted to know your opinion on the knife sheath itself. Not really a DNA question, but a sheath question. Wanted to know if you thought it seemed like it was maybe planted.
I'm going to give a nuanced answer here. I don't know if it was planted, but what I do know is that in Vargas's report, from an MPD report, she was paraphrasing some of what the medical examiner had said. The medical examiner had something like there were points on either side of these wounds, and below the hilt mark, which is where the guard would have hit the skin when the blade was inserted, that underneath that, there would be one point on one side and a D shape on the other. So when she's describing these wound patterns, morphology, I don't think she's actually describing a K-bar blade, because that is a single-edged blade. Some of these wounds, for me, and I could be wrong here, but when you have a point on either side of the wound, that sounds like a double-edged blade to me. So that sheath, for one, it's not the murder weapon. Two, I don't think it's outside the realm that sheath could have belonged to one of the victims or somebody who's associated with the house. So the sheath may or may not have been a crime time sheath, the whole thing. I don't know. There are people who keep stuff like that under their pillows, under their bed. They just keep it around in their room for various different activities. So to completely deprioritize the blood DNA record in this case, an elevated trace sample on an object that may or may not have housed the weapon, that may or may not have been owned by a victim or someone associated with the victim, that is, the whole thing isn't crime time. I don't think that that was followed through and investigated thoroughly. And so it may or may not have been planted, but I think there are other things to be cautious about. So even the things that I'm trying to be cautious about, another possibility would be it planted. But in my personal opinion, there's other things that are telling me this may not be a crime time sheath at all, whether it was planted or not.
Great answer. It's funny that you say that because I would say maybe a month or so ago, I text Mikey, you know who Mikey is, and I text him and I said, what if the sheath was from one of the victims pulling it out and trying to defend themselves, and the perpetrators just took the weapon from them, and now we're just left with their sheath? So it's interesting you bring that up or say that. So the next question I have for you, and I'm not sure if you know, but do you know if they took Q1.1 sample and actually compared it to Brian Koberger's actual DNA?
That's a great question, because when I was reading the ISP notes, there is not a sentence that walks through that item Q1.1 is likely Brian Koberger's, because you have item 108, which is the buccal swab. You have S108, which is the STR mix software identification label. But sometimes because next to the S108, it says for staff search. Sometimes a staff search can be a contamination protocol that is used for staff. It is I'm unsure if it is a contamination process. It could mean suspect, but they really needed to put that in there. What is your for staff search? What label is that in your software? Because if they were running a contamination process, that means they're trying to rule out one of their own. That because they have a separate database where they have those DNA's profiles so that they can eliminate them from the crime scene, because their DNA is probably on the crime scene because it transfers. So their transferred DNA is going to be at the crime scene. So they need a record of which DNA profiles they need to separate from the actual crime time, crime scene DNA. And then it also says the known reference sample of Brian Koberger, and then it says something generic like to this DNA sample. So you have 3 different identifiers for who supposedly that's supposed to be their DNA match, but there's no sentence that walks through item 108 is S108 is the reference known sample to Brian Koberger. And as I'm sure you know, that when I work in healthcare, everything has its own label. Everything has its own identification number. It's always very clear. And if it's not clear, we flag it and we take a look and we audit that account. So maybe the other staff at the lab, maybe they know what this shorthand means. But if you have an independent person looking at these lab reports, it is very unforgiving, because you're expecting these identifications to be clear and they are not. And I'm not sure if that's an issue. I mean, it could be in another redacted document somewhere, but from the ISP lab report, that dump that we got on Halloween, and I think we recently got another version that was unredacted, portions of it, that from what we have so far, I don't even know if they identified Koberger on paper.
I was wondering that. And I know, like, when I thought to ask you, I thought, well, gosh, that's kind of a silly question. You would think that they did, right? They just compared it to him to make sure it, excuse me, it was a match. And I couldn't find it anywhere. So
Yeah.
I was like, this is wild to me.
Yeah.
We should at least know that this sample actually does match him rather than somebody else or a family member or anybody. So
yeah, and you're asking potentially, if it would have gone to trial, you're asking a jury to make that decision, but you might not have that even in your paperwork. That doesn't seem like that should be in a death eligible death case.
Yeah. So I wasn't actually going to ask you this question, but I am going to ask it. Do you have any thoughts, or do you know why maybe this case was not a federal case, considering Brian Koberger crossed state lines? I'm just curious if you know or have any thoughts on that, because I don't know why it wasn't a federal case.
I don't know for sure, but if I were to speculate, I would say they didn't meet some sort of criteria. And I know that there has been some rumblings about did they even have probable cause. And so there might be some sort of threshold they need to meet for that. And I don't know if the feds can just say, no, we don't want this case. But I think it came down to some sort of threshold they didn't meet.
Okay. So the time frame in this case with the swab, from the swab to matching it, seemed fairly quick. Would you say that this was a quick turnaround time, or do you
Yes.
often see that kind of turnaround time? You think it's quick?
From what I've been reading, it takes a little bit longer to identify a source, especially the processes that Q1.1 went through. And it's also curious how none of the other DNA samples went through a similar process as Q1.1.
Yeah. Do you happen to know, so we had a fridge, right? And this fridge held samples, and the fridge broke down. And I know we talked about this on Dago's channel, and we said that the samples possibly were not ruined, and the dry samples necessarily didn't need to really be in a fridge, and that the fridge going out for a couple hours surely wouldn't damage a dry sample, or specifically ruin a dry sample. And that, excuse me, sorry, that they kept the dry sample in a fridge mainly probably to not collect bacteria. Do you happen to know what they do with the samples that were in the fridge? Do they like hold them over people's heads like, we have your DNA, or do they just throw them out, or what's, do you know what the process is?
I don't know the process in general, and I'm not sure the process for that particular lab. From my understanding, the process may be different for each lab depending on what their SOPs are. But I think at the most, they should have kept it, because I think they're supposed to keep it all the way through appeals. For the trial part, they're supposed to keep those on file. But I really don't know the protocol for if there's a possible contamination while in police custody.
Interesting. Yeah, I wasn't sure what they actually did with the samples that, just got ruined, but I didn't think they would necessarily be ruined because they're dry samples, so don't have to be in a fridge, but kept there to keep out bacteria. So I thought that, why wouldn't you just try to test them? See if something works, see if you get an answer. If not, then we get it. It could have been ruined, but especially where you have a death penalty case, you would think they would do everything possible.
Well, even upstream, before that happened, there was a decision made to deprioritize the blood samples and every other DNA profile in this case. So for me, in my opinion, it's not surprising they would have deprioritized that event as well.
Okay, so I have a question related to the blood stains that are on the half wall. Now, forgive me, I don't know what the numbers next to them are, but just in general, they seem to be somewhat diluted. And there have been people that have speculated that they became diluted simply because the doors were open and the environment got in, and that could have diluted these samples or stains that were on the half wall. Now, my thought was, if it was diluted that way, wouldn't we see condensation on the windows before we would see condensation on a half wall in the house? What are your thoughts on possibly how those became diluted, if they were diluted?
Wow, that's a really good question and observation you have there. I am not exactly sure about what the environment does to blood DNA. I'm much stronger with the trace DNA, and for me, they're completely separate things. But if I were to speculate, I do think because of the way that law enforcement, the detectives handled moving the furniture and moving the beds, and there was I think it was Matthew Modell who said that some of the DNA samples may have been diluted upon collection from the recovery method that the detectives used. However, I do know that there is a scholarly journal, there's many of them out there about environmental conditions. So I think it's a possibility, and I think this is something they may not have looked into, but I think it's definitely interesting whether it was dilution on the detective's part or something live environmental.
Interesting. So did they move the mattresses out before they even did anything with the bloodstains on the half wall?
From my understanding, and I think it was from an order Hitler had written, was that they did, I think it was actually in a footnote on one of the pages, because a state expert was going to testify about why they didn't test the entire mattress and that they did just take swatches of it. So I don't know what time that happened again, because the roles are ambiguous. And so I'm not sure the chain of custody. I can't see from start to finish how they did that. And I think with something of like as atrocious as this crime was, I think you really needed to take the entire mattress into your lab, not just throw it in the back of a pickup truck.
Yep. Yep, very much so. What blood stains would you have liked to see them take a swab of that they did not?
All of them.
Are there
Other
any in particular that you look at and are like, I can't believe you didn't grab a swab of this?
Well, before I answer that, other countries like in Europe and Australia, they document and record every DNA sample. They don't pick and choose and prioritize. For me, because I know that the state expert had to correct her testimony on the record, and she could not attribute that blood stain on the ping pong table to Xana, but she said in the beginning that was Xana, and she may have incurred an injury by the table. So when one of the detectives changed the numbers of these DNA samples, I have a question of, is that description accurate? You just didn't test for source? Was somebody injured there? Or did this entire sample with Xana's name on it, where she was injured by a surface, was that another location in the house? So whatever sample that is, I think that needs to be tested for source. And also 31.2, which was on the half wall, which was near, I think it was near the one where Ethan was the major, where I think that was 31.1. I think that all of the DNA samples, especially the blood ones on that half wall, should have been tested, especially if there's this question, if somebody was injured by the ping pong table, who was that? Was it a victim? Was it the perpetrator? I mean, it's got to be one of them. Somebody was injured there, possibly, if in fact that entire label wasn't shifted to another location, or was it just the name of the particular sample, was that just mixed up? So those are two in particular, but I would have liked to see all the DNA tested.
Yeah, great answer. I personally would have loved to see the gravity droplets by the edge, the threshold of the doors. I would like to see those tested, because you don't know if maybe one of a perpetrator got injured and is standing there with their own wound dripping blood.
Yep.
And not a victim. So I would have personally liked to see those. Do you feel that, so there were a lot of missteps in this case, in my opinion anyways. Do you feel that any of them were maybe deliberate?
I think this is a cultural situation. I think this has been the way that they do things in that area. I know that their coroner system has been criticized widely for many years. So was it intentional? I don't know, but I am pretty certain that was a cultural issue that these things happen.
Yeah. Lucy Morningstar in the chat just said the simple fact that the state's own expert wrote her report and failed to account for the label swap tells me that you can't trust any of it. And I think that's a really good comment.
Great comment, Lucy. Good to
Yeah.
see you.
So, is there anything about this case that isn't DNA related that maybe caught your attention and made you go, maybe they don't have the right suspect?
Well, when the PCA came out, I was reading it and it said that Dylan was in a frozen shock phase. And to me, that sort of sounds like a medical documentation, but it's not quite there. So it was a little muddy. And I thought this statement could be deceptive. Not that Dylan had anything to do with it, but her account of the timeline could be off.
Yeah.
And so if the timeline is off, you could have misattributed the suspect and the weapon depending on what it is, the elements you have at that different timeline. And if you're not letting the coroner in and you're keeping her off, who's to say? The timeline is usually a range. It's not a perfect science. So for law enforcement to not treat medical professionals as adults in the room and just say, yes, this is the timeline it has to be, as a health professional, I would have to say I don't agree with that. I think we need someone scientific to take a look and see what the actual range of time of death could be. And we shouldn't base it on somebody's testimony. I think that should have been a medical finding.
And it's surprising to me that we don't have a nailed down to the minute time of death when we very much could, because we have it in pretty much every other case since 1990 at least. But they can tell by liver temperature and stomach content, all that kind of stuff, plays a role in finding the time of death. And it's something that's happened for a long time. They have the ability to do it. And I'm shocked that we don't have that in this case. So what are your thoughts on IgG itself?
Well, I can tell you some of the independent experts on LinkedIn think it's complete BS. I happen to think it can be accurate, but I worry with our scientific tools that we're actually reading live environment DNA. And so the process can be accurate, but how do you know from a biological sample by looking at it what the intent and what time and how it got there? So, and especially in cases where you are using a related population, if any of this autonomy that the lab personnel, the DNA analysts have, or especially with borderline or low template DNA, did they accurately call an artifact or a peak? What were your thresholds? And if, especially with this DNA slot machine, and if you get a few of those wrong, that might not hurt much, but if you have a certain amount of them, I think that can certainly affect your IgG tree. And not only that, what does the IgG actually say? Again, I'm worried that they're just reading live environment, non-crime time, innocent DNA and saying, well, your DNA was found in a crime scene, so you probably did it, where yes, the state and the law enforcement historically would like the jury to believe that, but I think the scientific community is moving away from that because of, the research and the studies that they do. That activity level has a lot more scientific nuance than, okay, you found a source with technology that can read smaller and smaller amounts of naturally occurring DNA in our live environment.
Yeah. I personally think that IgG is so much in its infancy and not an exact science that at this point we should never be using it on death penalty cases, especially as the only piece of matching evidence or evidence that is convicting somebody.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just ridiculous. If you guys have any questions, if you want to go ahead and put them in the chat, I have one last question, and it is the most important question of them all. And we want to know, do you have any fur babies?
I don't currently, but growing up, I had a black lab. I am a
Aw.
big dog person, and if I did get a dog again, I would want a mini dachshund.
Oh, so cute. I saw one. I was walking Bronx the other day and I saw one and I was like, oh, it's so cute.
I
Those
know,
are
they're
so
so
adorable.
goofy.
I love dogs. We
Me
love
too.
dogs. I don't see any questions in the chat just yet. I'll give it a couple of seconds. Is there any input, anything you want to add, anything you have on your mind you want to talk about?
I just want to say that I have my Saturday mornings have looked like drinking coffee, and instead of the paper, they were scholarly journals on trace DNA and policy and regulations. And what I picked up from that is I like to ask about the rules. And I think we are allowed to ask about the rules. And I think caution should be taken whenever the state or the media or law enforcement signal that they have trace DNA. I know that this is a newer type of DNA that they discover because it's not your typical blood stain, but they are still trying to research activity level. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of trial and error before they even get that right. So I would say, with all of the information that I've shared, I hope that anytime you get that letter in the mail that you have to go in to that jury room, maybe you remember an article I shared or anybody from the community, and you get some support, and you, because the state and the court, they're not going to tell us. We are, the U.S. judicial system is behind the Europe and Australia when it comes to processing trace DNA and activity level in our court system. And so they're not going to tell you this. This is something that, you know, I think that the jury and the public, they should be educated on, or even allowed to ask, what are the rules? What are your thresholds? And so hopefully that gives you some sort of direction and support when you're in that jury room. So be cautious with trace DNA. Trace DNA is different.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for that. A couple of things I want to share with you. We do have a question, and it's about the knife. Misleading Evidence wants to know, wasn't the knife that Hunter had a double blade, like a double-edged weapon in your
Wow.
opinion? Do you know?
That is a great question.
Mhm.
And I don't know what knife he was holding, but if it was a double-edged blade, I think that deserved a lot more scrutiny. I mean, I could be wrong, but Detective Vargas was paraphrasing the medical examiner, saying that some of the wounds had a point on either side. That's
Very,
great.
very, yeah. And I think that makes a huge difference. It really does.
Yeah.
Another thing, Jen 7S sent $5. She said, great combo, important observations and insights tonight. Audrey, I cashed app you as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, love seeing strong women up here speaking their thoughts. So that is so amazing. Thank you so much,
Thank
Jen.
you
We
so much.
appreciate you.
Yes, that gives me more time to do my research and share public information for jurors, people in the court system, or anybody who wants to, you know, reform the system. So thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. Truth and Neurons said, Glitch DNA Lab, your videos are so undervalued. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more.
Oh, thank you
You
both.
add so much value to this case. And
Wow, thank
yeah,
you.
we just appreciate you so much. I haven't had a guest yet, but you're the first one I reached out to because I think you're just so informative. And yeah, it just adds so much value to this case.
Thank you so much for having me. That makes me feel so good you would say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Other than that, we appreciate you so much for coming on. I'm going to let you go ahead and do your nightly duties. So have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. That is so amazing. She is so intelligent and she is right on point with all of her answers. I just am so grateful that she said she would come on tonight. I cannot even express how happy I am and grateful that she came on. And when I tell you it is 2026 and it is so difficult to find people who are genuinely kind people to their core. And when I tell you that Audrey is one of the kindest people I have ever met, she truly, truly is. I mean that in her soul. She is just a great human being. So I'm so blessed that she came on tonight. And thank you everybody for tuning in. I just wanted to know if anybody's tuning into the Guthrie case and what your thoughts are on some of the newer information. I'm not sure if any of you are. And other than that, I don't really have anything else. I just wanted to go ahead and have Audrey on and ask her a handful of questions that I've had that I know that nobody else I really talked to could have answered for us other than her. So that's what I have for tonight. I appreciate all of you guys tuning in. Have a wonderful evening. Do something nice for yourself. Be kind, but more importantly, be kind to your animals. Bye, guys.